Hello, my name is Cliff Freilich. I'm the Executive Director of Cinema St. Louis, and we're the presenters of the 29th Annual Whitaker St. Louis International Film Festival. We're in our final weekend, but you still have plenty of opportunity to see lots of great films, so I hope you take full advantage. I want to have a brief reminder that we've been having a terrific series of masterclasses, of which this will be another with Beau Willimon, who's going to be talking about screenwriting. I'll introduce him more formally in a minute or two. But I did want to remind you that there's also a documentary masterclass tomorrow, same time at 1 p.m. with Ann DeMar and a local filmmaker and writer, Jeff Truesdell, will be working with her to present I'm sure, a very illuminating masterclass for those of you who are interested in making documentary or just want insight into how documentaries are made. All right, before we get started, I always want to give a shout out to the folks who are helping enable this, and that is the Chalapa Vedavali Foundation. They're the underwriters of this particular masterclass and all of our masterclasses. So we thank them for their great support. They also do our SE Awards, Films with St. Louis Connections, that we're going to be handing out awards on Sunday night at 7:30, another live stream to which everyone is welcome to attend, and it's a free event. So we'll be announcing all of our jury competitions and also our Audience Choice Awards. Next, I want to introduce the person who's going to be serving as my co-host of this Q&A, and that's Pete Timberman, who is the head of the Webster University Film Series. The film series is the co-presenter of all of these masterclasses. Pete, would you like to say a few words?
I would. Thanks, Cliff. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. If you live in St. Louis, the Webster University Film Series is St. Louis's only year-round nonprofit cinema. Under the normal run of things, the house that we screen movies in is the Winifred Moore Auditorium, which is in Webster Hall on Webster University's main campus in Webster Groves. We tend to serve as a hosting venue for the film festival when the film festival is in person, but of course the film festival is not in person this year, and neither is the Webster Film Series. We haven't shown anything in person since March, but we are still doing programming as usual. What we've been doing is a virtual cinema, not entirely unlike what your experience has been with SLIFF this year, where we book 1 or 2 or 3 films at a time that are the type of thing that we would show in person if we could, but we just can't right now. And then you pay, $10 or $12 and watch them on your computer, and we get half of that. But I would encourage you to keep an eye on our programming. Our website is webster.edu/film series. And on social media, Instagram and Twitter, we're at WU Film Series. At Facebook, we're at Webster Film Series. But yeah, we have new art house films, independent films, new restorations of older films. When we're in person, we do repertory programming too. There's been less of that since we've gone virtual. We do conversations not entirely unlike the one that we're doing today, though maybe not so high profile. But yeah, I would encourage you to please keep an eye on our programming.
All right, thank you, Pete. And as I say, Pete is going to be helping me run the show from the point of view of questioning Beau about his career. So let me introduce Beau Willimon. But before I do that, I have one last bit of housekeeping. This is a slightly different structure in the sense that although we still want your participation, you can certainly still ask questions, but the route for asking those questions is slightly different than what we've had previously. What we want you to do is, if you want to ask questions of Beau, go to our website, cinemastlouis.org, cinemastlouis.org, and then just go to the film festival site within it. Go to special events and then his event. It's pretty easy to find, and you'll find that we're using a Google form, and you're able to submit questions through that Google form. You can submit as many as you'd like. We're going to be talking with Beau initially, Pete and I, for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open things up and start asking the questions that have already arrived and the ones that will continue, I'm sure, to arrive through the course of this. The whole event will last probably around 90 minutes. So strongly encourage you to go to cinemastlouis.org, go to the special events section of the festival site, and then Beau's actual masterclass, and you'll find the link to the Google form. Very straightforward to submit the questions. Okay, now let me do a formal introduction. We are very pleased to have Beau Willimon. We would love to have had him back in person. Beau was a guest of the festival back in 2012 when we honored him with our Cinema St. Louis Award. because he is in fact a former resident of our town. His family is still here. We'll talk about, he's actually led a very interesting life, and so he didn't spend all of his time here in St. Louis as a kid. In fact, it's mostly, I believe, his junior high and high school years when he was here. But those are formative, so we'll ask him about some of those. You know him best, obviously, as he has a whole range of credits, and we're going to be getting into those in more detail, but he's an Oscar-nominated screenwriter for his very first screenplay that was produced, at any rate, not his first that he wrote, The Ides of March, which is an adaptation of one of his plays, Farragut North, and that was, of course, directed by George Clooney. So that was a pretty memorable debut, obviously. And then many of you are also familiar with his work as the showrunner on the first 4 seasons of House of Cards. So we'll talk about House of Cards. He also was the screenwriter of Mary, Queen of Scots, which I actually thought was a terrific film. Didn't get the kind of ecstatic reviews that Ides of March did, but I thought it was a really entertaining and fascinating film. We'll ask him about that. And then, of course, he had a Hulu series, the first, which regrettably only lasted a season, and we'll explore that with him as well. All right, so, and there are many other credits that we'll talk about as well, but let's now introduce Beau Willimon.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, Cliff, and good to be speaking with you, Pete.
All right, I'm going to kick things off here, and we should note that this is Beau's art studio. I was shamefully ignorant of the fact that he was a visual artist, and in fact, as I began doing my further research, I realized that, oh yeah, this is also prominently mentioned in his biography, so I don't know how I had managed to sort of scoot right on by that his original training, or the study, was actually in the visual arts, so we'll talk about some of that as well. But let me ask first about, I already referenced the fact that you moved around quite a bit as a kid because your father was in the military then. And then after your time in St. Louis, you obviously went to school in New York, but then you've lived many interesting places. You've spent time in Vietnam, you spent time in South Africa. So you've had a really sort of fascinating life beyond just the world of film. So talk a little bit about how all of that might inform your work, how important that is to who you are as a person, but also as an artist.
Yeah, well, I've been a bit of a vagabond of sorts. There's a song by Will Oldham, I believe, that is on a lot of my Spotify playlists called "Restless Fugitive," and it speaks to me because that's sort of how I feel. I get very anxious when I'm in one place for too long, and I think that comes out of my childhood. My father was an officer in the Navy for 31 years. So the first 10 years of my life was spent in a lot of different places. I was born in Virginia, but then we moved to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, then San Francisco, Philadelphia, and eventually St. Louis when he retired from the Navy. As a captain, we moved to St. Louis so that he could go to WashU to attend law school and have a second career. And I think that sort of in those early years, moving every couple or 3 years, kind of, it wires your brain into this sort of feeling that that you're supposed to be on the move, that you're not supposed to stick it out in any one place for too long. So by the time I graduated high school in St. Louis, I had lived there for 7-8 years, which was like at the time for me an eternity. And I went off to New York. Now, New York has been my home for 25 years now, which is crazy to say out loud. But that same restless spirit, I think, has stuck with me. So I always try to make it out of the country at least once a year, a little more difficult to do during a global pandemic. But I'm always looking for opportunities to head somewhere that broadens my perspective, that reminds me that New York is not the center of the world. And that involved moving to, well, right after college, I went and worked for the Estonian government in Tallinn for their Ministry of the Interior. It was part of a fellowship for Columbia grads to go and as young 21, 22-year-old whippersnappers help the Estonian government out. I was in no way qualified really to help them out, but the Estonian government itself at that time was mostly populated by people in their 20s because the revolution was fairly recent and they'd kicked all the old Soviets out. So the government was mostly people in their 20s and 30s running this country. And I did that mostly because I didn't have a plan. One theme that we may discuss at some point is ambition lacking plans. I didn't have a course that I was charting. I had not lined up a job. I didn't know what I was going to do. And so heading off to live in Estonia and work for the government there seemed like a way to have an adventure, but also delay actually finding myself in some sort of structured position or life. And then I came back to New York. I bounced around New York, all sorts of odd jobs, and sort of begged my way into a playwriting class at Columbia. Even though I had already graduated, I was no longer paying tuition. I had been dabbling in writing for theater, and I felt like I needed to actually learn something about it in order to have a shot at doing it well. And that led to the head of the playwriting program at Columbia, Eduardo Machado, who is still a very good friend of mine, saying, "Hey, if you write a play, I think you have talent from the class. What I've observed, if you write a play and you apply, I will take you in the grad program." I'm like, "Great, that sounds like a direction." But in the meantime, before I started grad school, I did attempt my first screenplay, and it was about the life of the professor who had taught me printmaking in college. I was a visual arts major. His name is Thomas Vu, and he grew up in Da Nang and Saigon during the Vietnam War. And his tale was sort of like the 400 Blows meets Apocalypse Now. Like he meets Huckleberry Finn. He was like a 10-year-old kid who was taking care of surfboards for the GIs in Da Nang. His mom was a translator for the army. His dad and granddad were both killed fighting for Arvin. And he would take care of these surfboards, wax them. The soldiers would pay him $1 per board. He and his friends would borrow the boards, paddle out into the ocean with grenades from the ammo dump, throw them in the water. They would explode, fish would float to the surface. They would gather the fish and then sell the fish and take some home for dinner. It was they would create booby traps for the Buddhist monks that were sort of walking the paths on the outskirts of Da Nang. And then Da Nang got too dangerous, so his mom sent him to boarding school in Saigon. But at that time, he was seeing Buddhist monks self-immolate. He was there in Saigon during the Tet Offensive. So he as a kid in this coming of age story bore witness to a nation in turmoil, and all he ever knew as a child was war. And then his mom married a Texan, a GI, after his dad was killed, and they moved to El Paso, Texas. So here's this 12-year-old Vietnamese kid who doesn't speak a word of English and is seen as the enemy by all of his schoolmates and getting his ass kicked every day, and having to adjust to living in the desert of North America. So that story to me was really compelling, and I felt like in order to write it well, I needed to actually go to Vietnam. So I managed to get a job through email correspondence with a small cultural magazine based out of Hanoi. They hired me via email. I flew over there and spent 6 months working there and traveling around Vietnam. I came back, I started grad school, and then in my third year of grad school, that restless feeling materialized again, and I applied for a visual arts fellowship. Even though I was in playwriting school, I was able through Tomas to get a grant to do a series of lithographs about paranoia in post-apartheid South Africa. And I headed off to South Africa with $15,000, which goes a long way in South Africa, and got a motorcycle, an apartment, and started traveling the country and doing drawings and and laying the groundwork for these lithographs. When I came back, I had to find an actual job and support myself. I had graduated school. My M.F.A. diploma didn't necessarily, get me a ton of jobs or anything. So I was temping and, doing more odd jobs. And then the Dean campaign came along. I'd worked in some political campaigns prior to that. And it was another way to sort of, I guess, escape, travel, run, whatever you want to call it. And I headed off to Des Moines, Iowa, and began working for the Dean campaign. Those experiences, of course, led to Farragut North. Fast forward a lot of years, and here we are.
So that incredibly diverse experience clearly on some level informs your work, not necessarily in a direct way, but talk a little bit about how you think that's valuable to you.
It's interesting because, I don't know, look, I said at the beginning of my long-winded answer that I feel like it's important to remind oneself that your universe is not the center of the universe. But I think that's probably more of a rationalized justification for just a spirit of restlessness. And you can look at artists like Emily Dickinson, who rarely ventured more than a couple miles from her home her entire life. And her world was was as vast or as rich, deep, layered, complex as anyone's, even though the radius might have been quite small. And you have plenty of artists who have been all over the world and lived a pretty adventurous life, and yet their work might be about mostly centering on a sort of formative moment in their life in a particular place, and not about all those places. So for me, how does this stuff inform? I think it's one ingredient in just a sort of overall and voracious and at times scattered curiosity. One of my flaws, I think, is that I'm too interested in too many things, and I can spread myself a bit thin in terms of, well, that's interesting, and I want to go there, and I want to dig into that, and so that's exciting for me as a person living a life, being able to have all those experiences. But I would like to think that they somehow inform my general knowledge, that they expand my sense of empathy, that there's a certain humility factor in seeing that your experience, reminding yourself constantly your experience is just one of 7 billion experiences. But it's tough to say how it in and of itself, like I can't draw a direct link. I can't say I have traveled and lived in all these places, therefore you can see in the work. I mean, I guess I will say that a lot of people tend to think that I only write political drama, and that just Farragut North happened to be the play that got me my break, but I had written 13 other plays over the course of my life that had nothing to do with political drama, and so that curiosity and interest in a lot of different things definitely shows up in my work. It just might not show up as much in the work that people are aware of.
Well, sort of to that.
Go ahead, Pete.
Sorry. No, sort of to that point, I was curious, do you see sense of place and or multiculturalism being major players in your work?
Sense of place is important, I think, in any good piece of art. Even if you're doing something that is absurd or surreal or like alternative universe, you need to be very specific about sense of place. One of my favorite films is 8.5, and I keep going back to 8.5 because I just have no idea how that's possible. I don't know how Clooney did that. And I think oftentimes, I found that writers that I admire, their favorite films are the things they can't do. Not the things that are similar to what they do, but the things that are the polar opposite. And like this spa that's in 8.5, where Marcello Mastroianni has gone to recuperate and find his, reconnect with his creative vision. is not a real place. It's a fantasy. It's a hyper extension of the imagination, and yet there's such a specificity to it. It feels like a real place. It feels like it has a deep history, you know. And so I think place is really important. Certainly in Farragut North, which became Ides of March, it's not so much Iowa itself as it is the culture, this sort of mobile bubble of political operatives on a national campaign. You know, when you're looking at something like Mary Queen of Scots, obviously at the heart of the story is this sort of burgeoning sense of national identity. What does it mean to be Scottish? You know, what does the landscape avail itself to? It's quite literally a fight over land in some ways. And when you look at the first, you know, that was a show that was about the first human mission to Mars, but the first season was really about Earth. It was about the lead up. What is the cost of actually embarking on such a dangerous mission, both personally and amongst your loved ones? When we were trying to figure out where to film, we had to take a lot of factors into account, and one of those is tax credits, right? We were making an expensive show, so we knew we needed to stretch every dollar, and it came down to New Mexico and Louisiana. And when I thought about filming this in New Orleans, the fact that there actually are quite a few NASA facilities in Louisiana, I made several trips to New Orleans and realized that, you know, this city, which is so rich and multifaceted, could be a character in and of itself. And so began to steer and shape the whole story towards New Orleans so that it really felt integral and not just a backdrop. So I think place, yes, multiculturalism is, I mean, that's a sort of all-encompassing and vast term. You know, does every story need to have a broad multicultural scope? Well, I think that's impossible. I mean, some stories are very small. You know, some stories might be about a specific culture or a specific milieu, and others might be more vast in terms of trying to paint a portrait of an entire community. I do think that it's important to be informed by, you know, to be very deliberate in terms of what your focus and your scope is, and be mindful of you know, your own blind spots, and also how even if you're exploring a very specific and focused milieu, that how that is informed indirectly or unconsciously by the larger community that might be outside the frame.
Before we start plunging into the various films and shows that you've worked on, speaking of sense of place, we should briefly talk, or have you talked, about St. Louis and how that factored into your life and potentially your work, and what you encountered here that you carry with you as you move forward.
Well, St. Louis was transformative for me. It was the first place that really felt like a stable home. Not that my childhood before that felt like unstable in a bad way, but I never felt like anywhere we were living was anywhere we were going to stay for very long. So St. Louis, I was able to put down some roots for the first time in my life. And we moved there when I was about 10. We lived out in Chesterfield. I went to 6th grade at Pond Elementary, which was very different from the South Philly public school I had been at a year before. But starting in 7th grade, I went to private school for the first time in my life, and I fought tooth and nail against it. I thought that private school was a bunch of snobs, and, you know, I was a public school kid, but my parents were adamant that this school, John Burroughs, was one of the best in not just the city, but in the Midwest, and that if I had the opportunity to go, if they accepted me, I should. And I visited the school, and I interviewed, and I looked around the campus, and then I visited their art department, which was their art building is nicer than a lot of university art buildings in terms of, you know, it's a 2-floor building that has pottery wheels and oil painting and kilns and giant plate glass windows that are floor to ceiling, getting north light. Like it just felt like this magical place. And so I was like, okay, yeah, if they take me, I'll go. And Burroughs completely changed me. I mean, the education there is exceptional. They're training both in the visual arts, which is where my initial instincts were, but also in the theater is definitely like university level. And you have Wayne Solomon, who was our drama teacher, had us doing things like transcendental meditation relaxation techniques and Meisner exercises in 7th and 8th grade. So as a 7th grader, when you're told, okay, you're in acting 1, and by the way, all students were required to take acting, every single student, and your teacher tells you, you think this is an acting class where you're going to learn lines and do scenes, but we're going to spend this entire first year simply learning how to relax. You're already at a pretty sophisticated level of training. So, I would say that Burroughs, in terms of my education, completely formed who I was in terms of knowing that I wanted to pursue a path in the arts, and having the training in order to really understand what that meant. And 2, politically as well. My parents were pretty conservative. I grew up listening to Rush Limbaugh on the radio when my dad was driving me to school. But it didn't take long before at Burroughs, I was reading my Marx and Engels and writing socialist tracts for the school newspaper. So I think, the 2 big currents in my life, art and politics, really were seated there. And then St. Louis is a city. I mean, it's a great place to, I think, grow up, where, I think of myself as like a 15-year-old. If I'd grown up in New York City, I would have gotten into way too much trouble. And St. Louis is big enough that you have great cultural institutions. You have the art museum, you have the history museum, you have a decent theater scene, you have the symphony, you have great universities like WashU and Webster that are showing obscure films, and you have the ability, if you are so inclined, to find the wealth of the artistic world in all its dimensions. But you're also in a small city where you're not overwhelmed and you have space to grow. And it's just, I just felt like, I desperately wanted to get out of St. Louis when I was 17 years old and get to New York. But I'm so glad that I grew up there, and I'm so glad that it's a place that I come back to time and time again. And, a big part of that was traipsing around the mean streets, the Loop. I worked at Brandt's as a busboy. My first job ever was as a concession guy and ticket taker and cleaning staff at the Shady Oak Theater in Clayton. In fact, my first painting studio, which was $60 a month, a tiny little closet of a room, was right across the street from the Shady Oak. And so, and the Tivoli at the time still had a massive hole in the ceiling, and it was leaking every time it rained, and it was just one screen. Hope Edwards, who's Joe Edwards' daughter, was in my class, and I was friends with Hope. And so the Loop at the time was mostly punks and bikers and houseless people. It had a little bit of grit to it. It felt like you were a little bit edgy hanging out in the Loop. Joe has transformed it into something completely different, and it's amazing to see the economic revitalization there, and to see 3 screens at the Tivoli now instead of 1, and you're not leaked on when it's raining. But I between vintage vinyl and the Loop, and the old Blueberry Hill, and making your way downtown for shows at Mississippi Nights, or seeing theater at the Muni or the Fox. I think it all combined to provide a rich sort of artistic life for a teenager. And the final thing I'll add to that is the art museum, which is free, was a place I went to at least 2 or 3 days a week after school. I could close my eyes and tell you in 1995 exactly where every single painting was. That's how many times I went. And it was a refuge for me. The fact that it was free, that you could just drive 10 minutes there from school, park, and just walk around a really excellent regional art museum. I mean, really, truly excellent. Was just wonderful. And you know, I think free access to art is a really important thing for both youth who, you know, barely have any gas money, but also a lot of people that can't afford to access art in other ways. So I also take a lot of pride that a lot of the institutions in St. Louis are accessible to the entire community without being a drain on the purse strings. I'm giving very long answers. I'll get shorter. I'm sorry. But you, when you take me back to, like, you know, it's sort of like this, like Rosebud territory. I get flooded with all of these. Speaking of, Manx coming out soon. We're all going to watch that, right?
We are looking forward to it. Speaking of the visual arts, since obviously that's where your initial training was before you moved into playwriting initially, and then finally, of course, screenwriting. Can you talk a little bit about that transition, and then how that visual arts training, which you continue obviously to engage in, informs in some way what you do as a writer?
Sure. Well, I think that visual arts, like drawing and painting, are similar to music insofar as that those are talents, at least in terms of raw talent, that people are born with. You can see those begin to exhibit themselves at quite an early age. You know, by 7 or 8, oh wow, that kid can draw really well. Or certainly sometimes by 5 or 6, a kid is playing the piano in a way like this person definitely has a musical gift. And so I think that the visual arts came sooner for me. And my mom was a visual artist. I just always, you know, before these things existed and before video games were completely and utterly ubiquitous, I just naturally found myself picking up crayons or pencil or pen and just always drawing all the time. It was my sort of go-to thing, and my mom, recognizing that, put me in some art classes, started, at quite an early age, where I began to get formal training, and so once I got to Burroughs, I'd already had a fair amount of training, and then at Burroughs, you know, for high school students, we had live models. You know, I was painting in oil paints by the time I was 14 years old. So by the time I got to college, I already had a good 10 years of formal training behind me. And I had a fairly natural talent as a draftsperson. The problem with that sort of talent, though, is that it's a dime a dozen. I mean, throw a stone and you're going to hit someone that can play a guitar pretty well or that can draw pretty well. There's a big leap between having a raw talent or facility and having a mature voice, a mature and original voice. It's why everyone that can play guitar really well isn't Jimi Hendrix. What is distinctive? What is true about you? What is the thing you have to offer through this medium that no one else can offer? And that's where I floundered. I mean, I was all over the place in terms of style and approach and very sophomoric thinking and trying to move into conceptual art, which I have no aptitude for. And I wanted to do super avant-garde, shocking stuff. And, you know, in the late 90s when I was in college, there was a real move towards digital and conceptual art as a sort of fad, and painting wasn't cool. So it's like, you know, if you wanted to paint, you couldn't paint, you had to do something cool. And so I was chasing acceptance. I was chasing style without substance. I was lost. And in order to compensate for that, I felt like I needed to try something that I had no idea how to do, that actually the ability to draw was hampering me because it was too easy to impress people just with the sheer veneer of being able to, like, of craft. So I had always been interested in the theater, and I decided I would write a play because I didn't know how to do it. I knew nothing about it. In my senior year of college, I wrote a play, which is a super weird, terrible play called The Goat Herd, that involves a goat herd, a seedy motel, and a mission to Mars, which I eventually got to, and Muhammad Ali. But it won a little prize because I think I was the only person that submitted that year, and gave me just enough sort of confidence to then go and beg to be in Eduardo Machado's class after I graduated. So I then started pursuing writing in a more serious way, and it kind of, took over my life. I suddenly I found myself in grad school for playwriting, and then eventually I had an agent and had a gig, and I was like creating a career for myself. But what I've realized over time is that a lot of writers will talk to you about hearing the voices of their characters, that writing is an act of listening, almost like you're a stenographer, you're a court reporter, and you have to do this strange thing where, of course, all of these characters in the story were coming from your brain, but you have to pretend that they're not. And you sort of have to separate yourself from your own imagination and simply let it play out. And your job is simply to record, capture as best you can what's happening. I don't listen to scenes, I see scenes. And I think this is true of theater as well. Eduardo Machado, and if you're not familiar with his work, he's a great Cuban-American playwright. His Floating Island plays are among the, it's like Cuban-American Chekhov, some of the best plays you'll ever read. But Eduardo would often have us imagine, as we were writing a play, he said, always pick a theater that you know and that you like, and then see the play on that specific stage. Do the set design, do the lighting grid, really see those entrances and exits. Don't imagine it as though, if it's set in your childhood house, don't imagine your childhood house. Imagine your childhood house as a set on a stage, right? So he already had us thinking about the frame, right? And the artistic presentation of this behavior that we're trying to capture. And I had a drawing teacher who quite early on, I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, said to me, the first 4 lines of a drawing are the 4 edges of the page. So your first mark is the 5th. Your first line is the 5th mark, because the frame begins the drawing. And if we're looking in this Zoom box right now, and in terms of composition, if I place myself asymmetrically here, and I have this, frame going on, I'm already beginning to create a sort of visual tension and dynamism. It becomes less interesting like this, becomes more interesting like this. And so those basic sort of tenets of composition, of structure, of visual tension and dynamism are the same sort of things that actually go into storytelling. Like when I am working on a season of a television show, I think about it visually. I sort of see this season as this sort of band, and along that band are places where it's sort of bulging, and places where it gets smaller, and places where, like if it were a color, it's a fast color as opposed to a slow color. There's a sort of rhythm and texture to the whole thing that is not unlike the composition of a painting. So I think of story in a visual way, and I also think of scenes in a visual way. I'm more interested, like, to me, language is simply one form of behavior. And Pinter, the great Nobel laureate, and Pinter said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but that language is a strategy for deception. That most of the time we're using language to lie to ourselves and to one another, and that real emotion and expression and behavior exists in between the lines or in spite of them. So I'm always looking at what people's hands are doing. I'm looking what their mouth is doing. I'm looking at how they move through space, where they position themselves in relation to someone else, those power dynamics. So when I'm envisioning a scene and I'm writing one, and this is particularly true for the screen, I'm more seeing the scene, and the dialogue is almost sort of like background for me. And I think a lot of writers approach it the other way, which is sort of like they're hearing the dialogue and then starting to build a visual world around it. I sort of work the opposite way. So I think the two things, I think the training that I got in visual arts has been supremely helpful for me in terms of being able to sort of stumble forward as a writer. I don't have a natural talent as a writer. It's sheer grit and hard work and many hundreds of hours to, try to get some good pages. I really have to fight for it. And the visual arts training gives me some of the tools to be able to do that.
Pete, do you have I don't want to dominate these questions, so if you have something you want to weigh in here.
Well, yeah, I was wondering, you started to get on this topic at the beginning of your last answer, but then, yeah, it went a little more personal, of course. I was wondering the reality of reading other people's scripts for you. How much of a player is that in your life? And then also, do you visualize them in the same way when you're not the one writing them, when you're just reading them? There's kind of a larger question there of how important it is to read the scripts of others when you're a screenwriter, but we'll start there.
Yeah, I know screenwriters that have read endless numbers of screenplays. I sort of came into screenwriting the way, so I'm not one of those people. I've read plenty of other screenplays, but I don't make it a habit. I have to read a lot of screenplays for work. I have a production company, and we're constantly looking at material or trying to find writers that we want to work with. So we're reading samples. So I read a lot of screenplays for work, but not like as I'm studying them, not in terms of like, let me study how someone wrote the screenplay from a craft perspective. Because, I'll get to the why in a moment. I came to screenwriting accidentally. Like, I never pursued a career in film and television. It just seemed impossible to me. I didn't know how one did that. I figured if I wrote a bunch of plays and they were done in small off Broadway houses to audiences of 60, and that was my life, like, that's a pretty good life. And I always said to myself, if I ever wrote a play that somehow made its way into Hollywood and that it led to that opportunity, great. Like that would be icing on the cake. But I didn't like move to LA. I didn't doggedly pursue Hollywood. Hollywood came knocking on my door with Farragut North. And that, again, it's this sort of like, I've always had a lot of ambition. I've always worked really hard, but I've never had a plan. So I never in a million years would have guessed that like I would have a career in television. I think these things aren't random. I'm not just sort of going whichever way the wind blows. Like, I grew up on television. Like, I loved like the early days of HBO and those shows. I think you look back and you're like, oh, actually all of these things were building towards and informing the path you took. You're just not fully aware of it. I was meant to go into television. I just wasn't fully aware of it back in 1994 or something. The question was, do I read screenplays? Well, certainly when I had to work on my first screenplay, real screenplay for Ides of March, I was scared shitless. I was terrified. I'm like, I'd read a few, but I don't know this form at all. Like final draft, like these weird interiors and exteriors, and when do you use fade in and all of these basic just formatting things freaked me out. So I read a flurry of screenplays just to sort of, so I could have like, not completely embarrass myself in terms of writing a first draft. But what I found when I was reading screenplays of movies that I loved, because I figured I would start with like my favorite movies, is you had like very wildly different styles. Like some of them are actually way overwritten. Some of them are super sparse, and you realize, oh, the director in this case really brought the juice, in terms of there wasn't a lot to go on. And you read others that where you're like, oh, it's like what I'm reading is exactly the movie that I saw. So in comparing that to reading plays, I felt like, well, one of the advantages you have with film is that you can go watch the film. And so more often than not, what I like to do is watch a film And then, the first time I watch it, I'll just watch it, just try to absorb it. But the second time I'll watch it, imagining the screenplay I would have written, right? So I'm getting the dialogue, and I'm paying particular attention to the words of the thing, but I'm also really starting to see the screenplay in my mind visually in terms of the structure and how did you get into this scene and how did you get out and all that stuff. And that to me is actually more valuable than reading the screenplay itself. In the theater, if I can go see a play, I would rather see it first before I read it. Because there I have its fully realized self. But because that's harder to do, you can't just stream a play. You're left with most of the time reading it. And I think plays are written more as literature. I've talked to playwrights like Tony Kushner and Susan Laurie Parks about this, where they see their plays as something that could exist purely as something that's read. Of course, they want to see the production, but I don't think people approach screenplays in the same fashion. It really is a tool. It is not a thing in and of itself. It requires the film to fully be realized, whereas a play can live, I think, more in the imagination as a written text. I don't say that to downplay the importance of screenwriting. It is the most important thing. You cannot have a movie unless you have a script. I mean, you could be Andy Warhol. You don't have to, but in terms of the films that we're mostly discussing, Hollywood and filmmaking culture in general has sort of downplayed and downgraded the role of the screenwriter since its earliest days. It's mostly been a director and producer driven business, and then eventually star driven. And screenwriters were sort of seen as second class citizens that were simply there as sort of work mules to throw some pasta against a wall that then the chef will go and actually, turn into a delicacy. But the truth is, none of them have a job without a script. You need a vision in order for the other great artists that are coming on board to have a place to start. And that's not to say that the screenwriter is the end all be all of the film. Of course, it is just the start, but that, unlike anyone else in a film, a screenwriter has to start with an absolute blank page. Where there was nothing, there now has to be something. Everyone else gets to start with something, right? And so, there's a sorcery in terms of screenwriters and playwrights of going from the where there was nothing to something that I think, and I'm of course very biased in all of this, being a writer myself, but I think, needs to be celebrated more. And I'm actually particularly looking forward to Mank because it touches upon that very thing. And by the way, one of the writers that worked in my room for 3 seasons of House of Cards was John Mankiewicz, grandson of Herman Mankiewicz, and he went by Mank. So for me, it's very weird because I called John Mank all the time, and this is about his grandfather. So,
well, not to mention that's directed by David Fincher. Yeah,
one of your former collaborators. Let's talk a little bit about that first screenplay that got produced, and talk about the transformation of play to film, and then you also had to again collaborate with others on that screenplay. You didn't get to do it entirely on your own. You obviously had others who came in afterwards, and that was distinctly, you work in conjunction with the others in theater as well, but the writer is sort of more paramount in theater, whereas you're more secondary. You made it clear why you're so important, but by the same token, you're going to be sort of losing a certain portion of your own voice and ceding it to somebody else. So talk a little bit about that first experience, doing that first draft, adapting your own work, and then how it then got transformed as it moved forward with others lending their own voices to it.
Well, first of all, as I mentioned, I was scared shitless. I felt like I was being thrown into the major leagues, having never gone to the minors. You know, I mean, people like George Clooney and Leo DiCaprio was a producer, Warner Brothers, all very intimidating. Um, so I just didn't want to embarrass myself. You know, I wanted I wanted to write something that, at the very least, didn't turn them off from the project. You know. And you know, I took the tack very early on of in my mind of not being precious about that script. It was totally ass backwards. Usually most plays are never turned into movies, and usually the ones that are have won a Pulitzer or had a long Broadway run. They are acclaimed plays. This play had never had a production yet. So they had gotten their raw material, the play, and said this would be a great sort of template for a movie, but it had yet to have a production. So uh, I didn't feel particularly precious about the play. I felt that there was an opportunity with the film to be able to try different things and new things, do the sort of things in the film that I couldn't do in the play. The play only had a handful of characters and 7 scenes and took place in 3 locations. In a film, you can really open that up. In a film, you can go beyond the second act because screen time moves a lot faster than stage time. So I was totally down to experiment with a lot of different stuff. And eventually I ended up writing a script that was quite a bit different from the play insofar as that it went way beyond where the play ended, and sort of explored the fallout of those final moments of the play. And then I turned it over to George Clooney and Grant Heslov. And most of the film that you see when you see Ides of March is their writing. They took bits and pieces of what I wrote and incorporated them here and there, but they had a much different take than I did, which was fine by me. My goal was to give them something to work with, which they could use, take it or leave it, whatever they felt was helpful. But so they took some of that. They actually then reincorporated a lot more text from the actual play than I had. So there's whole speeches and scenes from the play that I had not put in the screenplay that they put back into the screenplay. And then there was a lot of stuff that they wrote from scratch. So, you know, look, as an artist, there's a part of you that's always like, well, the thing that I wrote, the way that I would have done it, is exactly the way I want it to be. But I never really approached that film that way. I felt like I'd won the lottery. I felt like I had an opportunity to work with some of the great artists of our time. That film never would have gotten made if George Clooney hadn't not only decided to produce it, but also to direct it and star in it and go out and get the financing. Warner Brothers wasn't going to make that film because we were already into mega franchise territory with the big studios. So Clooney not only got that amazing cast, but he went out and he raised the $12 million that it was going to take to film it. And 12 million is not a lot for a film of that size. And he made it happen at the highest quality on a shoestring. So I just felt lucky, you know, and I was, there's plenty of me in that screenplay, but it was really a handoff situation. And then they ran with it. And, you know, I read subsequent drafts and shared some thoughts. But you know, that's really George's film. And I think it's a good film. And I'm very proud of what he and everyone else accomplished.
Now, were you able at all to be a part of the production when things actually moved beyond the screenplay and it went into shooting?
Not so much. I went and visited for a few days when they were filming up in Michigan. But once we got past the script writing phase, it was really Clooney's film, and he was off to the races, and I was kept abreast of things, but I wasn't an integral part of the production. And again, I just felt very lucky to be up there at all. Felt like a kid in a candy store. I mean, here are scenes that I've been reading on the page that now there's 200 extras, and there's George Clooney standing by a monitor over there. Oh, and there's Phil Hoffman smoking a cigarette. Maybe I can go smoke a cigarette with him. I just felt like, I had somehow woken up in a dream, in Michigan.
The reason why I asked that question, and obviously it's not typical that a screenwriter would be part of the production. It's rare when you're actually part of it. But your next major project that actually was realized, I'm sure you had others in between, but nonetheless, House of Cards, and you became a showrunner. So that was a pretty major transition, I would suspect, in the sense that had you actually at that point been on, you had some experience on the production of the Ides of March, but visiting. So how was that transition? And then we'll want to talk about your collaboration with David Fincher there as well.
Well, you're right. I'd had a few projects that didn't go. I'd had a blind deal with Warner Brothers to write another script, and I took a stab at Tale of Two Cities. I was like a lot of hubris. I was like the 7th writer in 25 years that had worked on that project. To give a sense of how old it was, the very first iteration of it with Warner Brothers was, I think, Terry Gilliam to direct with Mel Gibson starring as a young Sidney Carton. And by the time it got to me, Paula Weinstein was on the case and Leo DiCaprio wanted to star. There was no director, but they needed a script. And, I was like, I'm going to be the one to crack Tale of Two Cities. And I now know, looking back, never be the 7th writer on something. That usually tells you it's not going to, that you're not going to, do. And I read the previous scripts. They were all excellent. They just, it just never came together. So that hadn't happened. There was a couple other movies that I had written that didn't happen. And I was sort of at the place of when House of Cards came along, I'm thinking, well, I've earned some decent money from writing a few scripts. I had my moment. Maybe that's run its course and my Hollywood time is coming to a close, and I'll go back to my theater life. House of Cards came along and I got on the phone with Fincher. I really didn't want to do it at first. I didn't want to write another political drama. I didn't want to be pigeonholed in that way. But when you get on the phone with Fincher, and I don't know if either of you have spoken to him before, but he's brilliant. To state the obvious, he's savant-like in terms of his knowledge of craft and cinema history. And then his mind is just working at a speed and a scale that is several rungs higher than most of the rest of our ladders, and so I just felt like, okay, this is someone I want to work with. This could be interesting. And I had a lot of ideas for what it could be. But initially my goal was simply to write a pilot. If it got made, great. Then I would collect they would go make a television show. I would collect some royalties, which would give me a little financial stability and go back to whatever else I wanted to work on. But as I put a lot more time into it, and it, once we got set up with Netflix and it was clear that this was going to go and it was going to be kind of a big deal, I felt, I've become really invested in this story and these characters, and I like this team, and I want to stick with it. The notion, the idea of a showrunner was still developing, right? I mean, this was around 2012, and people really weren't talking about showrunners seriously as a thing, and until the sort of late aughts. We can look back and look at the Norman Lears or the Tom Fontanas or the David Chases, but they didn't think of themselves as showrunners per se. This notion of the kind of television auteur, as it were, or a big boss, was still a developing thing, but it was enough entrenched in the culture that I kind of knew what that meant. And I made the case. I said, I actually want to stick with this. I want to see it through. And I think that the powers that be were happy to hear that, because they wanted, they had liked what I had done on the pilot, and they knew that I was committed to the story and that I could then help shepherd it over the course of the first season. But I was very unexperienced. I was in my early 30s. I had not worked in any TV rooms before. And I was asking to have a huge amount of responsibility put on my shoulders. Looking back, I think it's sort of crazy that they allowed me to do that. Now, keep in mind this, Fincher had not worked in television before. Netflix had not worked in television before. None of it, I certainly hadn't. None of us really knew what we were doing. And I think that's the only reason I got away with it, is because no one knew any better, including myself. We were smart enough to hire really experienced people. I mean, I had some very experienced writers that I hired on staff. On the production team, we had some very experienced producers. We made sure that we weren't coming from a place of complete ignorance. And of course, Fincher, while he may not have done television before, of course, was an extremely experienced filmmaker and storyteller. So I feel like we weren't being reckless or cavalier, but there was a lot that we didn't know, and a lot that we didn't know we didn't know. And there's no way Netflix, I think, or any other network would have let a 32-year-old, 33-year-old kid run a show the way that I did these days, with the lack of experience I had. So I felt prepared to do it insofar as we had spent a year working on the pilot and what we were going to do with the story after that. I called a lot of different showrunners to get advice on the best way to run a room. I like forensically studied the season structure of a lot of the best shows. There weren't nearly as many of them, but I did like full on like analyses down to like page lengths for scenes and frequency of characters throughout, like of Breaking Bad and Mad Men and Sopranos. Like I wrote a 150-page Bible so that we'd walk into the room with really something to talk about. And I think it was adrenaline and fear. I knew that I was inexperienced, and I wanted to make sure that that we came to the table with enough tools to be able to not completely and utterly fuck up. And I made tons of mistakes along the way, certainly in House of Cards. I learned a lot of things the hard way, but I think if you're willing to do a 100-hour-a-week job, and you have a perverse sort of interest in things like budgets and schedules, things like that, and you have a certain amount of skill in terms of management and people skills. Those are all the things that have nothing to do with writing and everything to do with sort of, and I know I'm being long-winded here, but this is a big topic, and it's an important one, because show running is, I often describe the job as you're the director of the directors, right? And everything else for that matter. And there's a lot of different versions of what a showrunner is, but there's a lot of it that has very little to do with artistry. And I remember Fincher telling me once that it's like all these directors in film school think that it's 99% art is what they're doing, but really it's 99% bullshit and 1% art. That the 99%, which he facetiously says bullshit, it's not really bullshit, but it's all of like the things that have to happen in terms of hiring up crew, getting your budget in place. Like this location fell through, so we got to pick a new one. I got to make 2 days disappear on the schedule. I'm getting grief from this actor's agent because of X, Y, and Z. We haven't closed the deal on our costume designer yet. What are we going to do about that? There's a new head of production at the studio. I've got to build that relationship. Like all of these things, just in order to have the ability to try to make something special. And I speak to a lot of young writers who tell me their dream is to be a showrunner. And I go, that should not be your dream. Show running is something that you have to do in order to make a television show. But what you want to be is a writer. And a writer can be a screenwriter, a poet, a playwright, a novelist, an essayist, a historian. But show running is a means to an end. Like if you're telling me your dream is to pore over budgets and schedules and endless meetings, you know, production meetings and department head meetings and all that, while you're also trying to find cracks and crevices to finish episode 7 so that it can get into prep, you know, as an artist. That's a really weird dream to have, you know? So I think for anyone listening, you know, especially if you're just starting out, don't over glamorize show running. There are benefits to it. It has turned the table in terms of the writer dynamic. Unlike feature films, the writer really is the source of, in most cases, artistic vision and direction in terms of a show. But good showrunners will also tell you that this sort of auteur notion, whether it's directors or films or showrunners in TV, in reality is bullshit. I mean, I think one of I love the French New Wave, and I love Cahiers du Cinéma, and you know, the certainly at Columbia, my alma mater, auteur theory was taught like religion. But I think it's actually really destructive to creating expectations for the way that film and television is actually made, which is a very very codependent, interdependent collaboration between hundreds of people. And of course, there has to be some leadership, and there has to be a source of vision to sort of get things going and a sort of anchor. But a great film or a great TV show is not one person's vision. It's the collective vision of dozens or hundreds of people. And the showrunner's job, like the director's job in a film, is not only to inspire and give some sort of initial direction in terms of what people bringing their sort of tributaries into the river, but also to make sure that they're doing their best work, right? And to recognize that you can't make the thing without these people. Their job is not to work for you, right? Your job is to bring the best out of them. You know, and I think that's a really important distinction, because if you start to see your collaborators simply as kind of people who exist only to realize your vision, you're not going to get the best work out of people. And you're also going to be closed-minded to your own discovery of what they have to offer. And I say this as a complete control freak who has a very difficult time sort of getting off my stubborn ideas and into someone else's head. But I always have to remind myself that that actually leads to the best art. And like, you know, Citizen Kane, if we're talking about make, you know, Orson Welles, one of the things, many things he's genius about was he hired well. and he was so ignorant about filmmaking when he made one of the great films of all time that he didn't know how to fuck it up. So he let people like Tolman bring their best and revolutionize film. And he allowed that to happen. Of course, he contributed ideas to that, but you know, collaboration at its best is a lot about letting go. You know, and I think a lot of people who are starting out think of the showrunner or a director as someone who is in control, you know, and there are power dynamics and leadership aspects at play in any art making endeavor. But if you can have the self-assurance of your own vision to actually let go of it from time to time, or to allow it to evolve and transform, then you might actually discover something, and you might actually arrive at something that's bigger than yourself. And that's a lifelong lesson for me, one I'm still trying to learn and will continue to try to learn for the rest of my life. I'm sorry, I give the longest answers, but you ask such great questions, it just gets my mind going.
Well, we're going to let go now too, in the sense that we're going to turn things over to the people who have been listening. We've had a lot of questions come in, and I want to remind people who want to continue to ask questions that you do that through the Google form on the Cinema St. Louis website. Go to the SLIFF special events page, and to this masterclass, and you'll see the Google form. So Pete, would you like to, before one last thing, since we've had Mank come up several times and David Fincher, there is a wonderful profile of Fincher in the New York Times Magazine that deals with Mank, and Beau, you referenced his savant-like abilities. This really makes that clear, so I recommend that. So Pete, would you like to ask the first question from our viewers?
Yeah, you bet. I have Brendan Smith, who identifies as an entry-level staff writer, asks, what specific actions are you taking to increase entry-level and senior-level opportunities for Black staff writers, and what would Hollywood be doing now? And what should Hollywood be doing now that the summer's trend of reckoning with racism has fizzled out?
Well, so one of the hats I wear is president of the Writers Guild of America East, which is one of two unions that represent screenwriters in the United States. So our union represents writers east of the Mississippi. Sorry, St. Louis. But the WGA West is a wonderful union as well, and obviously we work closely with them. The issue of a lack of proper inclusion and representation in the film industry is something that the Writers Guild has been working on for many years. We have deep problems in our industry when it comes to inclusion. If you look at the membership of any of the unions, you'll see that reflected, how overwhelmingly white and male they tend to be. And so, that's a reflection of who's actually getting hired and working in Hollywood. There's a lot of different strategies that we have pursued, at least in terms of our turf and what we can do to improve things. For instance, we spent about a decade working on legislation in New York State to get a diversity tax credit, where there would be extra incentive for people to hire writers and directors of color and women on their productions in New York State, because we would do countless meetings with the employers in terms of, hey, you have to hire better, you have to be more inclusive, and they would say yes, of course, and then we started this. We kept seeing these bad hiring practices. So we figured, okay, well, let's tackle it from the bottom line. Let's actually incentivize better behavior, and that took 10 years of trying to get that legislation passed, and we eventually did. We have a program in New York called the Made in New York Writers Room, where we've teamed up with the city in order to do mentorship with established showrunners. 500 people can apply each year, 12 finalists are chosen, and they get mentorship. And these are from traditionally or historically marginalized communities. They get mentorship with showrunners over the course of 6 months, and many of them have gone on to get representation, at least before we got into our agency struggle, or actually gotten jobs as a result of that. We do a diversity study, which we put out every couple of years in order to point a finger specifically when it comes to the writing side of things, where we need to see improvement. We have seen some improvement over the last several years in terms of representation. It is creeping up and getting closer to reflecting our country, but still not anywhere where it needs to be yet. So we publicize those disparities. And then we also, like one of the things I was doing a couple of weeks ago is talking to a high-level hiring staff and producers at late night comedy variety shows, where you see some of the most egregious lack of inclusion, and saying, hey, we need to do better. What are the different steps in the hiring process for late night comedy where we can look for unintended or unconscious biases, ways that we can reach out to communities that might not even be aware that these jobs are available, and really work on in a very deliberate and dedicated way to making sure that our staffs are more reflective of the world around us. So there's not obviously a silver bullet strategy for these sort of things. We're looking at, the protest that occurred over the summer, a response to 400 years oppression. You know, the United States, America's original sin, and that sort of systemic infrastructure of racism and exclusionary practices, you know, doesn't get taken down overnight. But in the entertainment industry, I think there are a lot of things that we can do, are doing, to improve, hopefully at a better rate, faster rate than some of the other industries around us that aren't making as much of an effort. But there's still a long way to go, that's for sure.
Speaking of systemic racism, we should note also that you serve as executive producer on a documentary, a terrific documentary that's playing during SLIFF. So you have a couple more days now, today and tomorrow, to watch it, Lights of Baltimore. So I would strongly encourage you, if you're interested in these subjects, to look at that. It's a free screen. It's actually being offered for free. And it is also available nationwide. So if people are listening to this elsewhere, you have the opportunity.
Please do check that out. It's about the Baltimore uprising that resulted from the death of Freddie Gray. And the filmmaker Sabrina Borar spent 4 years working on it. And one of my passions is documentary filmmaking. I tend to watch far more documentaries than I do scripted or fiction. I guess grass is always greener on the other side. But in this case, I was lucky enough to be able to function as one of the producers on the film, and SLIFF has really gotten behind the film, and we're super proud to have it be part of the festival. So please do check it out.
I'll point out too, after the film, there's about an hour-long Q&A with Beau and the director Sabrina and one of the people in the film, Renee. And it's rollicking. It's a lot of fun as far as, like, if you're used to stodgy Q&As after films and film festivals, it's not like that. It's like a party. So be sure to stick around and watch the Q&A too.
Now I'm like subconscious. Am I being stodgy right now?
No. So we have a question from David Johnson, who's the president of the local Cool Fire Studios and also a board member of Cinema St. Louis. He references the fact that he was a huge fan of the first on Hulu and was disappointed when it was not renewed. He also, as a quick PS, Colin Stetson's score for the show was incredible. He asks you to talk about writing projects set in the near future and how that perhaps varies with writing for the present day.
Sure. Well, the only one I've written that's set in the near future is the first, and it was David, right?
Yeah.
Thank you, David, for watching it. I still occasionally get messages from people that are still discovering the first, and those that it connects with, it really connects with them. Not a ton of those people. We didn't get enough eyeballs on it to warrant a second season, but the people did connect with it. It really did, and I appreciate that. It's the only story I've written set in the near future, and the near future in some ways is harder, I think, than the far future. Far future, like if you're doing Star Trek or something, you can almost do anything, right? You can sort of say, well, this technology of teleporting exists, or there's wormholes, or people have the ability to levitate because we've evolved. The world is your oyster. But if you're writing something that's taking place in the 2030s, it's mostly going to look like our world, and yet there will be some significant changes. And we had to pick and choose. We didn't want it to be a distraction. We wanted like technology if it was more advanced than what it is now, to feel as humdrum almost in a way, as like you carry these things around, you drop it, you spill some pasta sauce on it, the screen breaks, whatever, I'll go get a new one, after my next paycheck. You don't really obsess over the technological doodads around you that 15 years ago people would have been like, ooh, wow, what is that? So we also had to be budget conscious, so we had to pick and choose what we could really spend money on. Like we talked to a bunch of futurists, we talked to people in the tech world, we talked to sociologists, we talked to historians, we really tried to get a sense of what will the world really look like. A few of the things we focused on were glasses, augmented reality glasses, which I think there's a decent chance will become the status quo in the next 15 years. But those were also, you you could put glasses on someone, stick a little light on it or something, and you had the feeling of something that was in the near future, but it didn't require, a whole bunch of, VFX, work and stuff like that to sort of sell it. We also, had automated self-driving cars, which I think you're going to see for sure in the next 10 years. A lot more of those. Those will be about 50% of cars on the road probably 10 years from now. And then the other thing was just the sort of notion that everything is a lot more interactive. You're talking to your house more, your house is talking back to you, voice activated things. So, we wanted to sort of lay that in, but we didn't want it to sort of overwhelm, because our main focus was the personal stories and also space, right? And we want to put our money and time into rockets and science and things like that. But it's also very strange to think about that, like the characters you're writing, if you're 15 years in the future, where they are right in this moment in 2020. And being very specific with that timeline of what has happened between 2020 and say 2035, which 15 years from now, you're going to be totally wrong on when people watch the show. So you want to insulate yourself a certain degree from the specificity of sort of placing it in a sort of political or historical context. And at the same time, because it's close enough to the present, you can't totally ignore that. So you're constantly trying to sort of strike these balances, where you're not trying to draw too much attention away from the story at the center, with all this kind of potential sci-fi distractions that avail themselves, and so it's really hard, honestly, and I enjoyed doing it, but there were plenty of times where I was tearing my hair out, being like, why can't I just write something set in 2020 where I don't have to constantly be thinking about all these little things,
The next question is from Jill Hamilton. She wants to know what the most important thing is to omit from screenplays.
Oh, that's a great question. What is the most important thing to omit? So I have two answers to that, and they're probably going to sound pretty big and vague. One is you have to omit anything that's untrue, right? So that's a big one, and that's sort of a catch-all for a whole bunch of things. But what do I mean by that? If you're writing something very naturalistic, so behavior as it's actually lived and experienced, you constantly need to do passes to the script where you are being really ruthless with yourself. Is this a true moment? Is the thing that this person is saying or doing right now, saying or doing it because it's coming from a place of actual rational or irrational behavior that is true to themselves? Or is that something I'm imposing on them? Am I forcing that? Now, if you're doing something that is not naturalistic, let's go back to Clooney. Although he's a weird sort of mixture of naturalism and I don't know, what would you call it? It's not magical realism. What would you call it, Pete? How would you describe Fellini's genre? If you
circus? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a mixture of naturalism and circus. But there's a logic, or let's take someone like Yorgos Lanthimos, right? Like there's a logic upon itself, right? That if you're going to create this sort of new logic or sort of parallel reality, Kafka did this, Borges did this, then it has to be true unto itself. So if you've created your sort of rules or mindset for it, then you have to do the paths where you say, is it being true to this new thing that I've created? And that's very hard to do, but that's number one. And number two, I always tell people when they're writing a screenplay that you need to write what you see. Tell us what you're going to see on the screen. Anything that I can't see probably shouldn't be in the screenplay, because you can write a beautiful prose paragraph about the emotional turmoil that someone is experiencing. But how do I see that? Like, don't describe to me what's happening in the inner life. Tell me what the character is doing, or describe the look on their face. Or what is that piece of behavior that reveals that turmoil? It truly is a show instead of tell medium. So if you find yourself reading anything in your screenplay that is not something I'm actually seeing, then that's probably something that can go.
John Meyer, who goes to Loyola Marymount, asks, I'd like to know what I can do as a college freshman to start building my network and getting connections. What did you do to get screenplays in the hands of others?
Well, John, like I said earlier, everything was kind of accidental for me. Now, that's not to say I didn't put in the work. I'd written a lot of thousands of pages before I ever got my first Hollywood gig. But I wasn't writing screenplays per se that I was putting in the hands of people. I wasn't pursuing it that fashion. I was writing theater, and that led to ultimately a play of mine getting in the right hands because I had an agent that sent it to someone. So that responded to it. So I did not approach it that way of sort of how do I build my network and get my screenplays in the hands of people. That's not to say that the way my path is a correct one. There is no correct path. There's no one way to sort of get your break or make your way into the industry. I do think that what you brought up in terms of networking is very important. Networking can sound kind of like a corporate or it doesn't sound very artsy, right? But it is crucial. Nothing in whether it's theater or film happens without a bunch of people being involved. And typically when people hire writers, they're often asking their friends, do you have someone that you recommend? Or they're going to people that they know. Like if one of your friends gets a break and they get to start a room, they might want to hire one of their friends. So building those networks is really important. Now, I think there's a lot more ways to do that these days than when I was first starting out, if you're based in St. Louis. The very fact that, there's so much virtual activity happening right now allows you to connect in ways that would be a lot harder if it was the late 90s. There wasn't really much of an internet, and St. Louis wasn't New York or LA, right? So I think there's a lot you can do in St. Louis. Certainly being involved in programming like you're seeing through SLIFF or Webster University's series. I think that, if you can volunteer to work as an intern or staff, not only expose yourself just to more film and people that have dedicated their lives to film, but other like-minded people that are working in that sphere who are going to be drawn to these same sort of events. That would be a good thing. Certainly if your school has a film program, find the people that share your sensibility, whose work you can champion, who can champion your work. Be there for each other, share pages with each other, really get to know each other as artists. You never know what those relationships will lead to. My first agent was really a result of the fact that a good friend of mine from grad school had gotten a meeting at AMC. They really liked his work, but he didn't have any ideas that they responded to. We talked about that meeting. I had an idea that I thought might work for them. He said, let's take it in together. We sold it. And then his agent wanted to represent me as a result. But that was just my pal from grad school. And you never know who's going to get in the door first. But the more important thing is in terms of having those friends and peers that champion your work and who you champion is that making art is hard. You're going to be riddled with self-doubt, and you're going to be riddled with imposter syndrome, and you're going to be riddled with just the frustration of all the obstacles and rejection along the way. And you need people that say they believe in you, and you need to feel the strength that comes from being able to tell someone else you believe in them. And the exchanges that you have as artists will actually, in the rigor with which you explore and dissect and criticize each other's work, will make you better artists. Number one ingredient, the only thing that you can say, there's 1,000 different paths to making a career for yourself as an artist. But the one true thing of anyone who's really been successful in whether that doesn't necessarily mean money, but I mean is making art that you admire, that is connected with you and lasted the test of time, is they all worked a lot, whether they had a job or not, right? Whether someone would allow them to make a film or they didn't wait for anyone to ask them to write them a script. Writers have to just keep writing thousands and thousands of pages. You have to have the goods. You can make luck happen for yourself, by doing things like volunteering for SLIFF or the Webster University series, by getting to know your classmates well, by looking for opportunities to insert yourself into the filmmaking community, to expand your circles. But if you don't have the pages to back it up, or the short film that you made on a shoestring to back it up, if you don't have the thing itself, if you're not actually delivering on the craft, that luck doesn't mean anything. You need to have the work, and what you should spend 95% of your time on is making things. And that is a very obvious thing to say, but people can become very focused on career building. But you have to remember that that's only in service of you have something you want to say and share with the world, and make sure you know what that is and that you're attending to that.
Hey, Beau, we're headed into overtime here because of the wonderful expansiveness. Can we do another half hour?
I've been long-winded here. Yeah, we could do about like another 20 minutes.
Okay, great. Then we'll continue. Go ahead, Pete.
Sure. The next question is from Lynn Venhouse, who is a film critic for the Webster Kirkwood Times, among other things. But she says that she saw an excellent production of Farragut North at the St. Louis Actors Studio last year, directed by the legendary Burroughs teacher, Wayne Solomon. How did Wayne influence your early aspirations and career?
Well, I was very lucky to be at the opening night for that production, and it was surreal for me because Wayne was that guy that I was telling you about who had us doing Meisner technique in 7th grade. And I remember in high school, all I wanted to do was please Wayne. Like I wanted to impress Wayne. I wanted to be cast in the shows. I wanted to, he was a hero of mine. And of course, he taught people like John Hamm and Ellie Kemper. I mean, John Burroughs has had a pretty good track record for a very small school of people going on to do some pretty remarkable things in film and theater. And I think you can attribute a lot of that to the sophisticated theater department that Wayne created at Burroughs. I mean, it was transformative for me because I had seen stuff at the Muni, stuff like Miss Saigon and No No Nanette and Brigadoon and the traveling road shows, and I had seen some of the big stuff at the Fox, like Cats and things like that. But I hadn't really experienced real theater. I think the first straight play that I saw was A.R. Gurney's Love Letters at the Fox in 1989. Was the first time I saw a play that didn't have music in it. And what Wayne did was treat a bunch of 12 and 13-year-old kids like they were true artists and say, we're not just gonna do some scenes from Romeo and Juliet and call it a day. This is a serious art form, and there's something to be learned that everyone can learn from it, whether you go into the theater or not, that can, relaxation techniques, the empathy techniques, the way that theater allows you to find presence in your body. These are all things that are useful to any human being. And then for those of us that really sort of caught that bug, we got to work at a pretty high level for a bunch of high schoolers. and I don't think you know, I didn't come out of high school thinking that I was going to go into theater or become a writer. I still felt I was going to be a painter, but I don't think I would have boomeranged back to writing necessarily if I hadn't had that sort of education at Burroughs in the theater department. So seeing that production was surreal for me because, you know, here's a guy who I feel like I owe a lot of my career to, and he had devoted, you know, a few months of his life to directing a play that I wrote. And so that was really rewarding and humbling.
Mike Lars White, who's a filmmaker with a short film in the festival, asks, how do you know when an idea has the potential to make a great feature film or series? He rephrases it, or how do you gauge whether to pursue something and write a screenplay about it?
That's a really great question and a tough one. My simple answer to that is I use time. So I'm one of those people that I might have 5 or 6 ideas a week that I think could be extraordinary, you know, and on the one hand, as an artist, you're sort of riddled with self-doubt and self-loathing and everything that I do is shit and no ideas I have are worth anything. And then the other end of the spectrum, you have to think to yourself like, I have something truly remarkable and unique to say to the world, and the world needs to hear it. And you sort of shuffle between those two places. You have to believe that you have something brilliant and worthwhile to say in order to like actually embark on, you know, the work of making something. But a lot of the times you're wrong. So how do you know when you're wrong? Well, I usually I'm a very impatient person, but I like to dive right into things. But I've learned over time to wait. That if I have an idea that I think is strong, I might make a few notes, you know, so I don't like completely lose it. But I might make a couple notes, and then I just sit on it. And if I find myself continuing to think about it without forcing myself to think about it, if it keeps popping back into my brain, I have another thought, and I have another thought. I'll sort of track that, and I'll keep like a little document in my notes pad on my phone, but I'm not forcing it. I'm just seeing if it comes. And if 4 or 5 months pass and I'm still thinking about it, and the ideas are beginning to build on one another, then it tells me, at least for me, I don't know about the rest of the world, but at least for me, it has legs. That means that for some reason I keep coming back to this, and that it is fertile ground for expanding the idea. If I forget about it, well, then it's moot, right? Like if I'm not thinking about it, eventually it'll just disappear from my consciousness, which means that it didn't have legs. I wasn't passionate or curious enough about it to continue thinking about it. And so I'll occasionally go back and look through my notes from like a couple years ago and be like, I don't even know what this idea was, you know? And the ones that stick around long enough, you know, Farragut North is a good example. I kind of banged around different versions of that for about 8 months before I started writing it. At one point, it was going to take place over 3 generations, over 70 characters played by 3 actors. I mean, I went through a lot of crazy, but there was something at the core that kept coming back. And there's a graveyard of ideas in this notepad that I don't even remember having had. So I think patience is the best way to gauge that. And then, you know, you may write the thing and you may do a bad job at it, or it may be the thing you're interested in, the rest of the world isn't interested in. So you never know what a good idea is. And maybe it might be a good idea that you executed well, but the rest of the world isn't interested or thought you executed poorly, but 30 years from now, those people connect with it and think it's good. So you have to start with, does it have legs for you?
So Krista Rapalia, which I apologize, Krista, if I mispronounce your name. She says that she's a curious human. She wants to know, what is your relationship with fear, specifically around creative pursuits and storytelling? Are you ever afraid?
All the time, yeah. I mean, I think fear is at the root of what we do. You can't, you know, people will often use words like brave storytelling or courageous storytelling, or that story really takes risks. And they use those words for a reason, because there is a cost to the truth. There is a cost to digging deep. it's not the same sort of risk of running into a burning building to save someone. Let's not kid ourselves about that. But you're delving oftentimes into places of trauma. You're delving into places of discomfort. You are mining the very things that you are afraid of deliberately on purpose in order to try to create something beautiful. There is the fear of failure, which I think every artist has to contend with probably on a daily basis. That failure is real. You can put something out into the world and it gets panned, and you've spent 3 years of your life working on this thing. And you either believe the critics are wrong or you realize they're right, and that you've just failed, I think for every piece of art that an artist is able to or lucky enough to put out into the world, we all, we know that there's 6 or 7 other things that you didn't finish, that you couldn't get there, that you failed at before they even got out of the gates, So it is a life of mostly failure in an industry that expects you to have to hit a home run every at bat, more or less, and can be really brutal if you don't. William Goldman, one of my heroes, the great screenwriter who wrote Princess Bride, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, HUD, Marathon Man, Misery, tons of other great films. This is a guy who had won he had won Oscars for All the President's Men, I believe, and Butch Cassidy, and been nominated for a bunch of others. But he had a couple of films that didn't get made at one point in his career, and he couldn't get work for 8 years. This guy had won 2 Oscars and written 5 modern classics. And it wasn't until The Princess Bride that he was able to turn things back around for himself. So it's a hard, brutal business filled with obstacles, rejection, and humiliation. And that's before you even put out into the world, and then a bunch of critics pan you, right? Or nobody watches. So yeah, there's plenty of reason to be afraid, but it's okay because, artists are like cockroaches. If there's nuclear war, cockroaches and artists will survive. We're scrappy. Because we are willing to deliberately investigate our own pain and other people's pain, it makes us strong. And you are choosing to withstand that sort of fear, to investigate that fear. And that is a blessing too. That liberates you. That makes you impervious. You're on a real journey. And if you have the talent to start with, and you have the willpower to persevere, what you are then allowed to discover and experience, and the process of being able to collaborate with others and to create something where there was nothing is something that a lot of humans would dream to be able to do, and you get to do it. So it's worth the cost. It's worth the cost.
Cara Day, who is with Champagne Movie Makers, asks, and this is a big question, one thing that often isn't taught is how to, quote unquote, sell your baby. How do you get the story off the page and onto the stage or screen? That's a really broad question, but talk a little bit about how you've gone about it. I realize, you've talked about some of these things and some of it was, you fell into it, but.
No, it's a really good question because, of course, you can have a great piece of art, but if it doesn't make its way out into the world, what not only is the world missing out on it, but that artist is not getting the attention they deserve, and being able to communicate with their audience. So how do you do that? Well, there's, again, no one size fits all for the salesmanship aspect. I know plenty of writers that are very bad at pitching things, or doing interviews or talks like this. They're introverts. They're people that have a vast imagination, and in that imagination, they can be the most charming, charismatic person in the world. But in real life, they're not that people. And so, they'll often have to rely on producers or representation in order to help sell for them. Now, there are other artists that are really good at being salespeople. They might not even be the best artists in the world, but they're really good at convincing people to take chances on them. And there's a little bit of like the sham wow guy, right? Like there's a little bit of P.T. Barnum in being able to present yourself in a pitch or to others in a way that makes them want to believe in you. Certainly like a version that I have to contend with often is I'm lucky enough that I'm at a place where I can get, the people at the various platforms and networks to read something that I've either written or that I want to produce. But it's still highly competitive. And in order to like put your best foot forward, like you're often going to want to have an actor or director attached. So it's like, how do you have a conversation with that actor or director to convince them, if they respond to the material, that this is something that they want to do? And every one of those scenarios is unique, because it's that given project, you as a person, and then who are you selling to? So I think there are a lot of sort of tricks that one can use when you're doing a pitch. That I think you can generalize things like, keep it brief, unlike the way I've been on this thing today. Use declarative statements as opposed to like, passive or use short declarative statements and sentences as opposed to like long winded and passive language. Make sure that they're experiencing the drama, whether it's a comedy or drama or not, that you're not just sort of tick-tocking through the things that happen, but that you describe them in such a way that they're felt emotionally. Don't try to introduce every single character. You might have 43 characters, and if you're trying to jam them all, the human brain over a 15-minute period of time might be able to process 5 or 6 characters with any level of depth. So you have to be judicious in terms of who you focus on. You don't have to say everything that happens in the movie or the play or the TV show. You just need to give enough sort of dramatic signposts that people get a sense of the story and aren't feeling overwhelmed with detail. And then, this goes back to the same advice I give for writing. Make sure that they're seeing it. Make sure that as you describe what you're pitching, that they can see it on the screen or the stage for that matter. And the question in terms of how to get your script in the hands of the right people, I wish I could give you an answer for that. It's sort of like, there's just no, if you're submitting to a theater, there are some theaters where they're getting hundreds of submissions a year, or to a film festival where you're going to get no after no after no after no until one of them says yes. I have sent Farragut North to 40 theaters around the country. They all rejected it until one day someone wanted to do it on Broadway, or make a film out of it. And then they all suddenly wanted to do it. But, one of them might say yes. So you just have to, like, the sheer volume of getting it out there. But then one of the earlier questions about networking, you just have to keep expanding your network because you might find some circuitous way to get it into someone's hand through this person that knows that person. But that's specific to your network. I would be a very, very wealthy and powerful person if I could tell you this is the secret to getting your script in the hands of someone that can get it made. There's just no one size fits all for that. I wish there was.
All right, we're reaching the end of our road here, I think. So we're going to allow one more question, and that will wrap. Pete, make it a good one.
Sure. I've got one from Gabe Sheets, who's been popular on these masterclasses, as I recall. He's an aspiring screenwriter. He says, for projects like the Ides of March and House of Cards, how do you approach doing research during the writing process? Obviously, you came to these projects with some of your own personal experience, but I imagine it was important to talk to people in that world. How did you approach that considering individuals in politics are especially hard to access and tend to be quite guarded and hesitant to provide useful insights. What other sources of information did you use apart from interviewing people?
Okay, hopefully I'll remember all the parts of that question. But leave some of that out. Tell me, Pete. Great question. Tons of research was involved. I knew a little bit more about that world than the average person just from having worked in a lot of campaigns. But clearly, if you're going to write a show like that, the play was a little different. That was a lot smaller and really based on some a campaign that I was intimately familiar with. I didn't have to research that as much. The television show, obviously, there was a lot of research that went into that. A lot of book reading, a lot of article reading, and then we had a political consultant, my friend Jay Carson, who had worked on a lot of national and state campaigns and worked on the Hill for Senator Daschle as one of his communications directors. Was our general overall political consultant. And then if we had specific things like we need to really know about this aspect of the Supreme Court, he would then help us find who we need to speak to. So in that, when we did our Supreme Court stuff, we sort of did some outreach and arrived at Neil Katyal, who you may see on Twitter and on cable. He's a pretty outspoken expert on legal matters. He was a former acting Solicitor General for the Supreme Court. And then you have a phone conversation with him. Here's what we're trying to do in terms of the story. He might come into the room. He might offer some ideas. We do a little work adjusting our ideas. And then we really start to get into like the nitty gritty of the story and line by line, word by word, scene by scene. Is this realistic? Is this plausible? Could this happen? What do you suggest? And we had to do that on all sorts of different fronts with House of Cards. So luckily, because the show after its first year was a hit, it wasn't usually hard to find people that would speak to us. Certainly, you can find some sort of experts that are a little hesitant to talk. But when you have a show that was a big one like that, people were usually very flattered to be asked and excited to be involved. And we were very, very lucky that we got to meet with and lean on the expert knowledge of a lot of very cool people along the way. But we also were constantly supplementing that by reading books and articles and, doing as much self-teaching as we could along the way. So that, I guess, let's 3:52 here on the East Coast, so 2:52. Just so we round it out, Pete or Cliff, if you want to do one more, you guys have a final one. I'll keep the last one brief, and then we can call it a day.
Sure, Pete. Why don't you? I'll yield to you if you'd like.
Sure. Well, I was wondering, the film that you're affiliated with here in the festival this year, Lights of Baltimore, you're a producer on. So here we're doing, a screenwriting masterclass, but the film that you're here with is a movie that doesn't have a script. I'm wondering how that type of work fits into this bigger tapestry. Like we've talked about, and you've talked about being a producer to a certain extent and reading scripts of others and things. But for your personal life, like how does that feed into your own screenwriting? How does show running affect your own screenwriting? Like how do these other hats that you wear feed into the actual act of screenwriting?
Well, producing, what I love about producing is that you get to facilitate other people's visions. There are plenty of stories that I'm not equipped to tell or that I'm not the best person to tell. And writers that have such incredible voices that you just want to see what they'll do with them and what they'll make and say, how can I help? I think that the more you work to support other artists, and the more you try to crawl into their headspace and explore their vision and be in service of, it makes you a better artist because you not only learn things from them, things that you can steal and that was cool, but also it helps you sort of in contrast define yourself. What am I not? Where are my limits? What makes me different? What makes them different? So you're just expanding your sort of, it's why it's so important if you're going to be a writer to read a lot and to watch a lot. Like you just need to know what else is out. When you produce, you get to be in the ground floor of that exploration with others, and then help also just make other cool art that's not your own, which I think is important. Like we can get really sort of self-centered as artists. It requires a certain amount of self-centeredom, you know, which is not the same as narcissism. It's just that you have to kind of sometimes disappear into yourself and become your own world. And so producing other people's work allows you to bring some of your experience and craft and network and all the things that you have and say, but it's not about me, it's about this person, you know, and that's satisfying. So I think if you're in a position to help produce, it does make you a better artist. But even if you don't have a production company, you know, when I started out in the theater, none of us knew anyone. Like we just all did each other's work for each other, you know. And those people, like in the basement of the drama bookshop, where we would set up folding chairs in a basically converted basement that we painted the walls black, are people like, you know, I'm watching Lin-Manuel Miranda do early scenes from In the Heights for 20 people drinking tall boys, you know. And Tommy Kail, who directed Hamilton and has worked with Lin ever since, directed my first reading ever of one of my plays for an audience of 8 people in that basement. Billy Eichner from Billy on the Street was doing early versions of a live talk show called Creation Nation down in that basement. Liz Merriweather, who you know, has done a bunch of films and the show The New Girl, and she was having readings down there. Annie Baker, Pulitzer winner, and you know, theater extraordinaire. We were all just doing our work for each other and helping. If it wasn't your reading that was being done that night, you were helping set up the chairs and the lights and inviting people for your friends' reading. So there's ways to produce insofar as being in service to your peers that I think makes you a better artist in general. You have to, art is an incredibly selfish act that aims for incredibly generous results. You have to start from what pleases me. What am I interested in? I don't care about the audience. I don't care about the critics. I don't care if this ever makes money. I don't care if anyone ever sees it. What do I do to please myself? But the goal ultimately is to create something that is an act of generosity, where you go, here is a thing. Here's a thing to feed you. Here's a thing that at the very least might help you get through a hard day, you know? And at the very most might change the way you think about the world, you know? And both are completely valid, you know? To go back to where the question started in terms of documentary, a story is a story is a story. A documentary film, even if you haven't written the dialogue for it, you're still thinking of narrative structure in the same way, in terms of rhythm, pace, themes, and it's just more sort of like you have the scene. It's like if you had a script that was already written and it's 1,000 pages long, and which portions of it are you actually going to take? You can't change the words, but you can pick the different portions of it and move them around in a way where you then have a 120-page script that works. And some documentary filmmaking does require some writing, but it's the act of sort of narrative jiu-jitsu there is not all that different than writing a film or a TV show. It's just you're using pre-existing pieces as opposed to doing it completely from scratch. I think that covered all of the pieces of the question, and it's been a real pleasure to spend this time with you. I know we went 2 hours, so thanks for letting me blather on. I should drink less coffee next time. But they're really great questions from you two and also from the audience. And thank you all so much for tuning in. And I hope some of this was of interest or help to some of you.
All right, thank you, Beau. We really appreciate it, and we hope that in a year or two, we're able to lure you back to town so you can visit family and come back to the festival, and ideally with a new project that we can show off.
I would love that. Well, congrats to SLIFF on pulling it off this year, and And I'm wishing the Webster film series all the best. I applaud you for persevering as well. And thanks to all of you lovers of film for keeping ambitious, bold, and adventuresome filmmaking alive at a time when theaters are closed and people are struggling. It's festivals like this that keep cinema's pulse strong and steady.
Thanks again. Much appreciated.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.